On the morning of January 13th, 1888, Judge Harlan McBride rode out to the McReary claim expecting to find two dead children and a woman who had run out of time. The temperature had dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. The snow stood 3 feet deep across the Nebraska panhandle, and the drifts against the north-facing structures ran higher than a man's shoulder. He had seen what that kind of cold did to people who were prepared. He did not expect to find anyone at the McReary place who fit that description. He had been wrong before. He had never been more glad of it. But that morning was still 5 months away when Sable McReary first saw the land that was supposed to save her. She came into Chadron on the last day of August, 1887, on a hired wagon that smelled of pine resin and other people's freight. The driver, a taciturn man named Burke, who charged by the mile and spoke by the syllable, pulled the team to a stop at the edge of town and pointed east along a rutted track that vanished into grass the color of old straw. 3 miles, he said, maybe 3 1/4. He did not offer to take her further. Sable climbed down with Delia on one side, and June pressed against her hip on the other. She was 34 years old, Irish-American brown-haired, of medium height and medium build, with hands that knew needlework better than axe work, and a posture that came from years of sitting straight at a sewing table, rather than years of bending over field rows. She did not look like a woman who belonged on the Nebraska panhandle. She did not feel like one either. But belonging had stopped being relevant the day Owen's foreman came to the boarding house door in Pennsylvania with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that told her everything before he opened his mouth. Owen McReary had signed the land claim 3 weeks before the haulage tunnel collapsed. He had believed in the railroad company's advertisement with the faith of a man who had spent 15 years underground and needed to believe that something existed above it. 160 acres of Nebraska grassland, productive soil, clean water, nearby opportunity, waiting for any man willing to work it. Owen had showed her the advertisement at the kitchen table, his finger tracing the printed words, his face lit with the kind of hope that only men who have worked very hard for very long can sustain. She had not argued. She had never been able to argue with that look on his face. 3 months later, she was standing on a dirt track in the Nebraska panhandle with $14 in her coat pocket, 2 daughters, and a piece of paper with Owen's name on it that entitled her to 160 acres she had never seen and could not picture. The claim shanty stood at the end of a 2-track path through grass that reached Delia's shoulders. It was 10 feet wide and 14 feet long, built from green lumber that had dried unevenly so that the boards cupped and warped away from each other, leaving gaps at the seams wide enough to see daylight through. The roof was tar paper over rough-cut planking. The floor was packed earth. A cast-iron stove squatted near the south wall, its pipe running up through a collar in the roof that someone had sealed imperfectly with tar that had cracked in the summer heat. One window faced south, single-pane, the glass slightly wavy in the way of cheap manufacture. A sleeping shelf ran along the east wall, wide enough for 2 people if they did not mind proximity. Delia stood in the doorway and did not say anything. She was 9 years old and had learned in the past 3 months to measure her words against what they might cost her mother. June, who was 6 and had not yet learned this, looked at the shanty and then looked at Sable and said, "Is this it?" "This is it," Sable told her. She spent the first afternoon taking inventory. 1½ cords of mixed cottonwood and scrub, stacked against the south wall, cut unevenly, some of it green, some of it punky with rot. The stove was functional. The pipe collar would need resealing before the cold came. The gaps between the boards were a problem she could see, but not yet solve. There was a well 40 yards to the east that produced water the color of rust for the first minute of pumping, then cleared. There was no barn, no outbuilding, no equipment of any kind. There was no team. Owen had planned to buy a team in the spring after the first season's crop had given them something to sell. Owen had planned a great many things that the haulage tunnel had unmade. She fed the girls dried beef and biscuits she had brought from Chadron, banked the stove against the September night, and lay awake on the sleeping shelf with a daughter on each side of her, listening to the wind find the gaps in the boards. The sound it made was not quite a whistle. It was lower than that, more intimate, more like the shanty was breathing in a language she did not yet speak. She was still learning its vocabulary when the knock came 4 days later. The man who filled the doorway was not what she had expected, though she had not known what to expect. Edgar Pruitt was 58 years old, with a businessman's soft hands and a businessman's careful eyes and a coat that had been cut by someone who charged for the privilege. He wore the kind of boots that had never stepped in anything worse than a puddle, and he moved through the world with the ease of a man accustomed to having the ground arranged for his convenience before he arrived. His smile preceded him by several steps. "Mrs. McReary." His voice carried the warmth of a man who had practiced warmth until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. "I've been meaning to call on you. Terrible business about Owen. Just terrible." She had not told anyone in Chadron about Owen. She said so. "Small community," Pruitt said. "Word travels. May I?" He stepped inside without waiting for an answer which told her something, and his eyes moved across the interior with the speed and thoroughness of a man who had assessed distressed properties before, which told her more. He looked at the stove, the gaps in the walls, the cord and a half of questionable wood visible through the south window. He did not look at the girls who had retreated to the sleeping shelf and sat watching him with the stillness of children who have learned that adults in certain moods require stillness. "I'll be direct," Pruitt said, which meant he had decided that directness was the approach most likely to work. "I have a small business interest in helping people who find themselves in difficult circumstances. People with land they can't work, debts they can't carry, winters they can't survive." He let that last phrase sit in the room for a moment. "Your claim is worth $300 to a buyer who has the means to develop it. To you right now in your current situation, it is worth exactly whatever keeps you and your children alive through March." He spread his hands in a gesture of regretful mathematics. "I can offer you $40. Clear any debts you've incurred, by passage back to wherever you have family, leave you something to get started." Sable looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $14 in her coat pocket. She thought about the burned-down hope on Owen's face when he had shown her that advertisement. She thought about what $40 and a train ticket east actually meant: a boarding house room, laundry work charity. If the laundry work ran dry, her daughters growing up in the margins of other people's lives. "No," she said. Pruitt's smile did not die. It adjusted. "I understand. Think it over. I'm not going anywhere." He moved toward the door, paused, looked back with an expression of genuine seeming concern. "Do you know what winter is like out here, Mrs. McReary? Not winter the way they have it in Pennsylvania. What comes across this plain in January?" He did not wait for an answer. "I'll be in touch." He left. The dust his wagon raised had not settled before Sable understood that he would be back, and that each time he returned the offer would be different, in some way she had not yet anticipated. The neighbor came 3 days after Pruitt. Ruth Calloway arrived on a wagon. She drove herself a practical gray mare, pulling a practical gray vehicle with no ornamentation whatsoever. And she climbed down with the efficiency of a woman who had been climbing down from wagons for 30 years and intended to continue for 30 more. She was 52, angular in the way of people who have been weathered rather than worn, with gray-brown hair pinned with more function than artistry. Her eyes moved across the McReary claim the way a carpenter's hand moves across a warped board, reading the surface for what the surface conceals. "Ruth Calloway," she said. 2 miles east. I've been here 7 years." She did not offer this as pride. She offered it as credential. She accepted coffee, sat at the table Sable had improvised from a plank and 2 nail kegs, and looked at her hostess with the directness of someone who had decided long ago that the world contained too much trouble to waste time approaching it indirectly. "I buried 2 neighbors the winter of '85, she said. "One in January, one in February. Both thought they had enough wood. Both thought their walls were tighter than they were. Both were wrong in ways that couldn't be corrected after the fact." She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. "I am not telling you this to be unkind. I am telling you because you are new to this ground and new to this cold, and the people who don't understand what's coming tend to find out in ways that don't allow for a second attempt." Sable asked what she needed to know. Ruth told her. 4 cords minimum for a structure this size, 5 if the walls leaked like these did, 6 if the winter ran hard past February. She had 1.5 cords, some of it questionable. The nearest timber worth cutting stood miles north along the creek breaks, and even if she had a team and wagon capable of hauling loads, which she did not, she could not fell and buck and split what this winter would demand. Not alone. Not with 2 children and hands that knew needle and thread better than axe and maul. "The arithmetic doesn't change no matter how many times you run it," Ruth said. She stood, rinsed her cup at the water bucket, set it on the plank with the precision of a woman who had learned not to waste motion. Pruitt has already been here. It was not a question. 4 days ago. Ruth nodded as though this confirmed a schedule she had expected. He'll be back. The price will move. She looked at Sable with something that was not quite pity, because pity required hope for the other person that Ruth Calloway had learned not to extend prematurely. Think carefully about what you actually have to offer this winter, Mrs. McReary, against what this winter will demand. The numbers are not in your favor. She drove east without looking back. Sable stood in the doorway for a long time after the wagon disappeared. The grass moved in a wind that carried the first suggestion of something colder behind it, the way a river carries the smell of rain upstream before the rain arrives. She thought about the arithmetic. She ran it again. Ruth was right. The numbers did not change. She thought about Pruitt's face when he had said it was worth whatever kept her children alive through March. She thought about Owen's face in the lamplight over that advertisement. She went inside and started mending June's dress because the mending needed doing, regardless of the arithmetic, and because the work of her hands was the one thing she could control while everything else remained beyond her reach. The trouble with the land surfaced on the 9th day, which was the day Sable walked into Chadron to register her presence at the county office and discovered that a man named Cole Drett had filed a competing interest claim against the property. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, who delivered bad news with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered it, often explained that Drett had been working the land informally for 2 years, had made improvements to the structure. She looked around the shanty and tried to identify what those improvements might have been and had filed a prior use petition 6 weeks before Owen's homestead claim had been processed. The competing petition had been submitted through an attorney of record, Edgar Pruitt, Esquire, Chadron, Nebraska. Sable stood at the counter for a moment. Then she asked who adjudicated competing claims in the county. Judge Harlan McBride, the clerk said. His office was 2 blocks north. McBride was 60 years old, built like a man who had been substantial once and had reduced to essentials over time, with the kind of face that recorded everything without advertising what it thought about the record. His office smelled of paper and pipe tobacco and the particular dry warmth of a room heated by a good stove for many years. He listened to Sable present her situation without interrupting, which she recognized as the habit of a man who had learned that most people given enough silence will tell you the things they initially decided to withhold. When she finished, he looked at Owen's documentation, which she had brought in the document folder she carried against her ribs inside her coat. He read it with the attention of a man who understood that the difference between a valid claim and an invalid one often resided in a single sentence that most people read past. He set the papers down. Your husband's filing is procedurally correct, he said. The prior use petition is weaker than Mr. Pruitt would like it to appear. You will likely prevail in a formal adjudication. He paused. Likely is not certainly. The hearing will take 10 days to schedule, another week to conduct. During that time, you hold the claim. Sable said she understood. McBride picked up a pen, set it down again, looked at her with the directness of a man who had spent enough years watching people in difficult situations to have lost patience for unnecessary softness. Mrs. McReary, I am going to rule in your favor. I believe I am also going to be doing you a disservice, and I want you to understand why before I do it. He opened a desk drawer, removed a single sheet of paper, placed it on the desk between them. The county has a responsibility to the welfare of children living within its jurisdiction. If I adjudicate this claim in your favor, and the circumstances at that property do not meet minimum habitable standards by April 1st, I am required by law to consider alternative arrangements for your daughters. He let her read the relevant statute, which she did word by word. This is not a threat. It is the law, and I enforce the law regardless of my feelings about it. I want you to know it exists before you make decisions based on winning the land dispute. Sable folded Owen's papers back into the document folder. She looked at McBride across his desk. Rule in my favor, Judge, she said. I'll handle April. He studied her for 3 seconds longer than was necessary. Then he picked up his pen. The ruling came 80 days later, one sentence prior use petition dismissed for insufficient evidence of formal improvement. Original homestead filing of Owen Michael McReary subsequently transferred to Sable Ann McReary as surviving spouse and legal heir, recognized as valid. Coldret's name did not appear in Chadron after the second week of September. Edgar Pruitt's office was 2 blocks north of the county clerk, and he knew how to read a ruling. He came back on the day after the ruling posted. The offer was $50 this time. He explained the increase with the logic of a man who respected his opponent enough not to insult her with a static number. He also mentioned, as though it had just occurred to him, that he had become aware of a note outstanding at Kraus Hardware in Chadron, $18 on the cast iron stove currently installed at the McReary claim. He mentioned it with the casual generosity of a man noting a detail he thought she might want to know. Sable said no. Pruitt nodded, as though this too were part of a schedule he had anticipated. It was the third week of September when the girls changed everything, though Sable did not understand that until later. June had been coughing for 2 days, not seriously the mild, scratchy complaint of a child adjusting to a new climate and a new dust, the kind of cough that needed warmth and rest more than medicine. Sable kept the stove burning through the day, fed it steadily, kept the shanty as warm as the wood could manage. By evening, the coughing had eased. June fell asleep early, curled on the sleeping shelf. Delia read by stove light until her eyes gave out, then settled beside her sister. Sable sat at the plank table, mending a split seam in Delia's coat, working by the light of the oil lamp, the stove ticking steadily behind her. The work was familiar and the warmth was enough, and she did not notice herself becoming less alert by increments until she woke with her forehead resting on the coat fabric and the lamp burned down to its last quarter-inch of oil. The stove had gone cold. She did not know for how long. The room was dark and the room was cold, the kind of cold that had moved in quietly while she slept and made itself at home in every corner. She did not check the time. She went to the sleeping shelf first, moving by memory through the dark, reaching for the girls with both hands, and found June warm. Not the ambient warmth of blankets. Warm. Genuinely, sustainably warm in the way of a living body holding its own heat against a cold room. Sable stood in the dark, holding her hand against June's sleeping back for a long moment. Then she reached past her to the surface of the sleeping shelf and found it cold. She crouched and felt the floor around the base of the stove, searching by touch. The packed earth was cold. The iron legs of the stove were cold. But where the rough floorboards met the stove base on the south side, there was a section where the earth had been replaced by flat stone river. Stone dark-colored, lightly textured, placed there by whoever had built the shanty for reasons she had never thought to question. June had shifted in her sleep until she lay half on the sleeping shelf and half on the floor, her side pressed against that stone, her cheek resting on the cold board above it. Sable pressed her palm flat against the stone. It was warm, not hot, not even comfortable. The fire had been dead for at least 2 hours by her reckoning, the iron of the stove cold to the touch, the air cold, the earth cold, the boards cold, and the stone was warm. Not residual warmth, not the memory of heat. Actual warmth, present and consistent, as though the stone had decided independently to maintain something the rest of the room had surrendered. Sable sat down on the cold floor beside her sleeping daughters and did not move for a long time. She was not a scientist. She had not studied the properties of materials or the physics of heat transfer. What she understood from that moment forward was something simpler and more durable than scientific principle. The stone had been given heat, and the stone had kept it, and the stone was giving it back now, slowly in the dark, long after the source was gone. The air had surrendered instantly. The iron had surrendered within the hour. The stone was still here. She thought of her mother's kitchen in Pennsylvania, the soapstone beside the cook stove that her mother set the bread pans on, that stayed warm through the afternoon when the morning fire had burned down to ash. She had filed that observation away as a fact about her mother's kitchen rather than a principle of the material world. She understood now that she had been wrong about the category. The problem was not only how much wood she had, the problem was what happened after the wood burned. She did not sleep again that night. She sat beside the stove with a candle and ran the arithmetic a different way. In the morning, she walked to Loop River. The river ran 3 miles north and slightly east through ground that dipped and cut the banks carved by water into exposures of layered rock that showed in cross-section like the pages of a book left open to the middle. The stone along the banks and in the shallow cuts was flat, dark gray, dense-looking, splitting along its grain into sheets of varying thickness. She had walked past this stone on her first visit to the river and seen only rock. She crouched at the bank now and picked up a piece the size of a bread plate, maybe an inch and a half thick. It was heavier than it looked. She set it down and picked up another thinner the size of a large serving platter split cleanly along its grain with no visible crumbling at the edges. She turned it over. The fracture surface was smooth and tight-grained. She carried 3 pieces back to the shanty. She set them near the stove, not on it close enough to absorb the heat radiating from the iron sides. She did the rest of the day's work water from the well, mending the girls' lessons from the primer she had brought from Pennsylvania dinner from what remained of the dried stores. In the evening, she checked the stones by pressing her palm to each one. Warm. All 3 uniformly and steadily warm, warmer than the air, warmer than the floor, warmer than the table beside them. At midnight, she checked again. Still warm. At 2 in the morning, warm. At dawn, cool but not cold. Not the dead cold of the boards. Something between. Sable made her decision over coffee, while the girls slept the stone beside the stove, still holding the last of what it had been given. The arithmetic had not changed. She still did not have enough wood, could not get enough wood, could not afford to hire the hauling, even if the wood existed within accessible range. But the arithmetic was not the only calculation available. If she could not get more heat into the room, perhaps she could keep more heat in the room. If she could not increase supply, perhaps she could reduce the rate of loss. Stone held what you gave it. Loop River was full of stone. She built the sled that afternoon from scrap lumber and rope. 2 runners cut from the straightest boards she could find in the material Lars had left behind, a platform of cross planks between them, a rope harness she rigged to her own shoulders because she had no animal to pull it. She dragged it empty to the river that evening to test the weight it would carry. The ground was still dry enough that it moved without too much resistance across the grass. She loaded 4 of the larger flat pieces she had sorted from the bank and pulled the load home. It was harder than she had expected. The loaded sled wanted to follow the low ground, required constant correction on anything resembling a slope, and the rope harness cut into her shoulders through the coat fabric within the first quarter mile. She made the round trip twice more before dark. She was pulling the 3rd load through the edge of Chadron, taking the most direct route from the river path back to her claim when the man noticed her. He was working outside a wagon repair shop on the east side of the main track, planing a wheel spoke with the focused attention of someone solving a problem in wood that required more patience than force. He was 41 or thereabouts, with carpenter's hands and a face that had seen weather without being beaten by it. He set down the plane when the sled went past, not rudely, but with the natural attention of a man whose work requires him to notice how things are constructed and whether they are constructed well. His voice reached her before she had passed completely. "What are you building?" Sable did not stop pulling. "Something that holds." He stood there a moment. She was 20 yards past him before she heard the plane pick up again. She did not look back. She did not know his name. She did not need to yet. By the end of the first week of October, she had hauled perhaps 3/4 of a ton of flat stone from Loot River and stacked it against the outside of the south wall. The hauling was the hardest physical labor she had undertaken in her life, harder than she had been prepared to acknowledge even to herself. She woke each morning with her shoulders seized into a stiffness that took an hour of movement to work out. Her hands developed blisters that broke and bled and dried to calluses that split and bled again. She lost 3 pounds in the first 2 weeks, weight she could not afford to lose because the work burned more than the food she could provide herself. But the pile grew. She began stacking inside against the north wall. First, the wall that faced into whatever the Great Plains sent down from Canada between November and March. The wall that was coldest to the touch even on mild autumn mornings. The wall where the gaps between the boards were widest and the wind found its best angle. The stacking was harder than the hauling because the hauling required only endurance and the stacking required judgment. She had never laid stone. She had no instinct for which pieces would sit stable and which would shift. Her first attempt, 3 courses high against the north wall, fitted by eye, and supported by nothing except contact pressure, came down in the night, not with a crash, but with a sliding, settling sound that she heard from the sleeping shelf, and lay awake waiting for the rest of to follow. By morning, she had a pile of flat rock on the floor, and a north wall as bare as it had been in September. She started again. The second attempt held for 4 days before the middle courses shifted outward and several pieces fell. She rebuilt. The third attempt stayed up, but she could see, pressing her palm to the stacked surface, that the upper courses were leaning slightly away from the wall, loading their weight toward the room rather than toward the structure behind them. It would hold until it did not, which was a situation she recognized as the kind that failed catastrophically rather than gradually. She was still working on the fourth attempt when Ruth Calloway came by again. Ruth stood in the doorway looking at the partial stone wall with the expression of a woman who has seen enough human projects to know the difference between ambition and plan. "You're lining the inside," she said. It was not a question. Sable explained what she had observed. The stone beside the stove, the warmth still present at 2 in the morning, the rate at which air lost heat compared to the rate at which stone did. Ruth listened without interrupting, which cost her something Sable could tell. When Sable finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I know what a root cellar lined with stone feels like in July," she said. "I've been in those cellars, cold enough to keep milk without ice. You want to build that inside your house?" "The stone is cold when it's cold," Sable said. "It's warm when it's been warmed. The same property that keeps the cellar cold keeps the room warm if the stone has been heated first." Ruth looked at the wall, looked at the stove, looked at the gap between them where the stone would have to travel from one to the other in the form of absorbed radiant heat. "If you can't warm it fast enough," she said, "if the fire burns down before the rock takes the heat, you'll have a house full of frozen stone, and not enough wood left to heat it out again." She shook her head not in contempt, but in the manner of someone who has been asked to validate a calculation that could go either way and does not want to be present when it goes the wrong one. "If it fails Sable, it fails at the worst possible time." "I know," Sable said. Ruth left without endorsing anything. Sable went back to the wall. The stonework found its form slowly through failure rather than instruction. She learned that the flat pieces stacked more stably when she staggered the joints, placing each upper stone so its center sat above the seam between the two stones below, rather than directly above a single stone's center. She learned that the lower courses needed to lean slightly inward toward the board wall, so the weight of the upper courses pressed the wall together rather than pulling it apart. She discovered that packing dirt and ash into the gaps between stones made the whole assembly behave more like a single mass and less like a pile of independent objects waiting for a reason to separate. She did not know these were established principles. She arrived at them through observation and repetition in the way that people isolated from instruction sometimes rediscover what accumulated knowledge already knew. By mid-October, she had 3/4 of the north wall lined to waist height. She pressed her palm to it on the evening of the first hard frost after a full day of steady stove burning. The stone was warm. Not the surface warmth of a material that had been briefly heated, the consistent, even warmth of something that had absorbed heat through its full thickness and was releasing it uniformly. She held her hand there for a long time. It was not enough yet, one wall partial height, but it was working. The news that Sable McCreary was filling her house with rocks traveled through the section the way news traveled in any small community where people had fewer things to watch and more time to watch them. Ruth told no one directly, but Ruth spoke with Berta Sims at the mill on Thursdays, and Berta had a husband who talked. The wagon driver Burke mentioned the sled loads of stone he had seen Sable hauling. The Chadron merchant who had sold her a 10-pound sack of dried beans on the 3rd of October mentioned to someone that the McCreary widow was buying less wood and more rope. The consensus was divided between the charitable interpretation that grief had temporarily impaired her judgment and the less charitable one that grief had permanently impaired it. Pruitt heard, of course. He came on the 14th of October with his offer adjusted upward to $60 and a new expression on his face that he was less successful at managing than usual. Something behind the professional warmth that moved closer to calculation than concern. He looked at the stone wall on the north side, visible now risen to her shoulder in the center, and at the pile still stacked outside, waiting to go in, and at the raw tracks in the earth where the sled had been making its regular passage from the door to the wall. He picked up one of the flat pieces from the inside pile, weighed it in his hands, set it down. 40 tons of rock won't keep a room warm, Mrs. McCreary, he said. I've been out here 11 years. I've seen a great many things tried. Rock is what you put under a house, not in it. Thank you for the advice, Sable said. Something flickered behind his eyes. He set the flat piece back on the pile with a care that was its own kind of message. The offer is $60, he said. It will not be $60 in November. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the businessman's warmth, not the opponent's calculation. Something that might in another man have been genuine worry. Whatever this is, Sable, it isn't going to work. And the time you're spending on it is time you're not spending on arrangements that might actually help you. She told him no. He left. She was pulling on her coat to go back to the river when Judge McBride arrived on horseback, which was unusual for a man who generally drove a buckboard, which told her the visit was deliberate and time-sensitive. He dismounted with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees had been complaining for several years and tied his horse to the fence post she had not yet gotten around to straightening. He stood in the doorway looking at the stone wall for a long moment before he looked at her. Pruitt filed a new motion this morning, he said. Not a property dispute this time, a welfare petition. He's requesting a formal review of the living conditions at this claim, citing concerns about the safety and adequacy of the shelter for minor children. He watched her face. I have to tell you about it because I'm the one who'll hear it. I also have to tell you that welfare petitions carry a different standard of evidence than property disputes. I can't dismiss it on a procedural technicality the way I dismiss the prior use claim. Sable's hands were still on her coat buttons. She did not finish fastening them. The hearing is scheduled for the 15th of December, McBride continued. That gives you approximately 2 months to demonstrate that this structure can adequately shelter 2 minor children through a Nebraska winter. He looked at the stone wall again, the unfinished courses, the gaps, the places where the stacking was still uneven. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were the eyes of a man who was running the same arithmetic she had been running and arriving at similar conclusions. I am going to be honest with you, Mrs. McReary, because I believe you are a woman who prefers honesty to comfort. I don't know what you're building here. I don't know if it will work. What I know is that if it doesn't, I will have no legal choice but to find alternative arrangements for your daughters. He paused. I want you to understand that clearly before you decide how to spend the next 2 months. She understood it clearly. She understood it clearly enough that after he left, she stood in the cold room for a full minute doing nothing at all, which was a luxury she rarely permitted herself and could not afford now. Then she picked up the rope and walked to the river. The pile of stone outside the shanty grew through October. The wall inside grew slower because each course required more care than the previous one, and the upper courses required care she was still learning how to give. She was on her 4th design for the lower bracing when October turned cold enough to make the morning trips to the river a matter of discipline rather than endurance, the kind of cold that makes every unnecessary motion feel like waste. She was sorting through a scatter of flat stone at the river bend on a morning when the slow shallows had begun to skin with ice along the edges, trying to select pieces by the characteristics she had identified as reliable indicators of quality, density, evenness of color, the way the stone rang against another piece, rather than giving a dull thud when she heard footsteps on the bank above her. She straightened and turned. The man standing on the bank was not tall, but he had the kind of physical presence that occupies more space than height alone accounts for. He was 64 years old, which she would learn later. In that first moment, he appeared ageless in the way of people shaped more by work than by time. His face deeply weathered, his hands enormous and scarred in the manner of someone who had spent decades handling materials that do not apologize for their weight. He wore working clothes that had been repaired many times and had passed beyond repair into a kind of permanence. His eyes moved across the stone she had sorted with the speed and accuracy of a man who had spent a great deal of time looking at stone. You're sorting wrong, he said. His voice was flat, carrying the Ohio River Valley accent that flattened vowels and hardened consonants into something almost Germanic. You're choosing by color. You should choose by weight. Sable looked at her sorted pile. She had been selecting the darkest pieces, following the instinct that the darker stone held heat better, that the darkness itself was an indicator of density. The dark ones hold heat better, she said. The dense ones hold heat better. Color tells you nothing. He came down the bank with the ease of a man comfortable in difficult terrain and picked up one of her rejected pieces, a lighter gray slab she had set aside for its pallor. He held it toward her. Feel that. She took it. It was heavier than it looked, noticeably heavier than a darker piece of similar dimensions that lay beside it. He took the piece back and struck it against another stone. The sound it made was sharp, almost metallic, a ring that sustained for a fraction of a second before dying. He picked up one of her selected dark pieces and struck it the same way. The sound was dull, flat, gone the instant it was made. Listen for the ring, he said. Dead sound means soft stone. Ring means hard. Hard stone takes heat and holds it. Soft stone crumbles and cracks the second or third time you heat and cool it, and then you have a wall full of gravel. Sable looked at her pile. Then she looked at him. Cornelius Voss, he said. I live 8 miles north. I heard there was a woman pulling stone from this river with a sled. He set down the stone and looked at the direction of her claim, which was not visible from here, but which he clearly already knew the location of. I heard Pruitt is trying to take your land. I knew a man named Pruitt in Ohio 20 years ago. Different man, same type. He began sorting through the stones she had rejected, setting some aside and leaving others. I build with stone. Built 3 structures on the James River before I came out here. Knew what I was doing then. Still know. He did not look up from the sorting. You don't. You're close to right on the principle and wrong on almost every technique. Why are you telling me this? He was quiet for a moment, his hands moving through the scatter of rock with the practiced selectivity of long experience. I had a daughter, he said. It was not an answer to her question. It was the only answer he was going to give. He sorted for another 10 minutes, teaching her as he worked how to test each piece before adding it to the load, how to identify the seam line along which a piece would split cleanly versus the random fracture of inferior material, how to read the exposed faces of the bank cuts for the strata most likely to yield good material. She watched and listened with the attention of someone who understood that she was being given something that would not be repeated. Then he stood up, brushed his hands on his trousers and said, "Show me what you've built." She walked him back to the claim. He walked the interior the way she imagined a doctor walked through a house looking for illness methodically, with attention to the things that would be easy to overlook. He pressed his palm to the north wall where she had stacked to shoulder height, knocked his knuckles against the stone at intervals, crouched to examine the base where the first course met the floor, stood and looked at the distance between the wall and the stove. The joints are wrong, he said. You're stacking them in columns, each stone directly above the one below. The weight has nowhere to go except straight down to the weakest point in the column, which is whatever gap you left. You need to offset every course. Center each stone above a joint, not above a stone. He moved to the corner where she had tried to pack dirt into the gaps. This is the right idea done with the wrong material. Dirt shrinks when it dries, falls out in 3 months, leaves your gaps worse than they were. Clay from the riverbank mixed with ash from the stove, dense enough to fill without shrinking, cheap enough to replace if it cracks. He looked at her with an expression that was not unkind and not warm, that was simply the expression of a man who had decided to be useful and was being useful. The lower courses need to lean into the wall, he said. Not vertical, angled. 5 degrees maybe. The weight of everything above presses down and into the boards behind it. Makes the wall want to close, not open. He paused. You've been building a stack. I'm telling you how to build a wall. Sable asked when he could start. He was there the next morning before she had finished breakfast. October deepened. Sable and Neil Voss, she thought of him by his full name at first, because the formality seemed right for a man who offered nothing beyond his function, worked the north wall together, then turned the corner onto the east wall, then started the stove corner, which Neil insisted on doing first, once he understood the principle she was working from. The stove is your source, he said, framing it in the language of construction rather than physics. Everything closest to the source charges fastest and holds longest. You don't put the most distant piece first and work toward the furnace. You build the mass around the source outward like rings in a pond. He had her disassemble part of what she had built and start again closer to the stove, tighter to the iron sides where the radiant heat was strongest. He also taught her to fire differently. You've been building big fires, he said, watching her load the stove with a split log the diameter of her forearm. Big wood, fast flame, quick heat. That heats air. Air doesn't remember anything. You need coals, sustained even patient coals. He adjusted the damper, restricting the draw. Small wood fed often. Think of it as feeding a forge that has to run all day, not a bonfire that has to impress someone for an hour. Give the stone 4 hours of steady warmth, and it will give you 4 hours back. Give it 1 hour of violent heat, and you'll have a cracked wall and a cold room by midnight. She thought of all the fires she had built in the 6 weeks since arriving. Blazing hot when she had wood to spare, cold ash when she ran low. She had been fighting the cold with the wrong tool, throwing heat at the air, that held it for an hour before leaking it through every gap and crack in the boards. "You're not storing heat," Neil said one afternoon, pressing his palm to a section of wall they had built 2 days earlier. "You're slowing its departure. There's a difference. Anyone can make heat with enough fuel. The problem is that heat leaves as fast as it arrives. The wall doesn't create anything. It just holds the door open a little longer." He looked at her to see if she understood. She understood completely. He did not come every day. He came 4 days in 5, sometimes 5 days in 5, sometimes 3, with a regularity that suggested schedule, but never quite committed to it. He arrived at dawn and left at dusk. He never ate at her table, though she offered. He worked with the economical focus of a man for whom conversation was a distraction from the primary business of doing things correctly. Once on a late October afternoon when the light was going amber and flat across the grass, and the temperature was dropping fast enough to feel it happen, he stood back from the north wall and looked at what they had built. 3 courses properly offset, angled inward, the gaps packed with the clay ash mixture he had shown her how to make. He pressed his palm to the surface, held it there for a count of 10, removed it. "Anna would have been 26 this year," he said to no particular audience. Sable set down the stone she was holding. She did not respond because there was nothing to respond to that would not reduce the statement to something smaller than it was. Neil picked up the next piece from the pile, tested its ring against the stone beside him, and placed it on the course with the precision of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. They kept working until the light was too far gone to continue. The last week of October brought the first killing frost, the kind that turned the grass overnight from amber to gray and left a 1/4 inch of ice on the water bucket by morning. Sable woke to visible breath and lit the stove before she did anything else, feeding it the way Neil had taught her, small pieces, steady building toward coals rather than flame. By noon, the stove corner and the north wall were warm to the touch, and they stayed warm through the early evening, even as the temperature outside dropped to the high 20s. It was working. It was not working fast enough, and it was not working at enough of the wall, and she had perhaps 6 weeks before the December 15th hearing and an indeterminate number of weeks beyond that before the real cold came. But it was working. On the last day of October, Pruitt came one final time before his schedule changed. He did not make an offer. He stood in the doorway and looked at the walls. The north wall nearly complete, the stove corner dense with stone. The east wall started, the west wall still bare boards, and he looked at the court of good stone still piled outside, waiting to go in, and he said something she did not expect. "You know I'm going to win the December hearing," he said, not with malice, with the flat certainty of a man reporting weather. "McBride is a fair man, and fair men follow the law, and the law says a board shanty with open gaps in the walls does not qualify as adequate shelter for children under 12. You can fill it wall to wall with river rock, and it will still be a board shanty with open gaps." Sable kept working. She did not stop to face him. "I found out this morning. Pruitt said that Kraus at the hardware store sold me the note on your stove. $18 outstanding, due on demand." He let that sit. "I haven't decided yet when to demand it, but I thought you should know." He left. Sable set down the stone in her hands very carefully because her hands were not as steady as she needed them to be, and stood still for 30 seconds. Then she picked it up and kept going. Without the stove, there was no heat. Without heat, there was no way to charge the stone. Without charged stone, the wall was simply cold material in a cold room, exactly what Ruth had warned her it could become. She had no way to pay $18. She did not stop working. She worked harder, if anything, more hours each day at the wall, more trips to the river on days when Neil did not come, more careful selection of stone based on everything he had taught her, more precise fitting of courses, more patient, clay ash packing of joints. The wall was the only thing she could control. She controlled it. 4 days later, before dawn, she heard hooves and wheels on the track. She came to the door to find Ruth Calloway's gray wagon. Ruth climbed down in the cold morning dark and held out an envelope without preliminary explanation. Sable took it. $18 in paper money. "I've been here 7 years, Ruth said. "I've saved money every year because that's the kind of woman I am. I'm not giving this to you. It's a loan against the claim to be repaid when you're able." She turned back toward her wagon. "Pay Kraus before Pruitt remembers to press the note. And don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I am tired. I am so deeply and genuinely tired of burying people who might have lived if someone had done one concrete thing at the right moment. She drove east without looking back. Sable held the envelope in both hands in the cold morning air. The sun was not yet up. The stone wall inside her shanty held the warmth of yesterday's fire, still measurable under her palm, still giving back what it had been given. She owed that warmth to everything Neil Voss had taught her, and she owed the stove that created it to a woman who had spent 7 years disagreeing with her and still come through the dark to make sure the argument could continue. She owed more than she had words for. She went inside and built the morning fire small and steady, feeding it the way she had been taught, letting the heat flow out into the stone at the rate the stone could accept. The day's work was waiting. The December hearing was waiting. The winter, which cared nothing about hearings or debts or what she owed or why, was waiting behind it. She set the envelope on the plank table and did not look at it again. There would be time for gratitude later when the walls were finished. There was only time now for the wall. Showmore Neal came on the 1st of November with clay. Not the riverbank clay Sable had been using, which was too sandy and cracked when it dried, opening the gaps it was meant to seal. He brought a bucket of clay from a deposit he knew 8 miles north, darker, finer grained, with the plasticity of material that had been laid down in slow water over a very long time. He mixed it at her table with ash from the stove in proportions he had worked out through previous failures. He did not describe testing the consistency by pressing a small amount between thumb and forefinger, watching how it behaved when he released it. "Too wet and it shrinks," he said, working the mixture with his bare hands in the cold room, steam rising faintly from the bucket. "Too dry and it won't bond. You want it to barely hold the impression of your thumb. No more." Sable watched the test and filed it alongside everything else he had shown her. The ring of good stone, the offset of courses, the angle of lower layers in the part of her mind she had been devoting entirely to this project since the night she found June warm on the cold floor. He demonstrated the application on a section of the east wall she had built the previous week, pressing the mixture into gaps with his thumb, smoothing it flush with the stone faces, leaving no air pockets, no bridges, no voids where cold could pool and resist warming. His hands moved with the confidence of someone whose knowledge lived in his fingers rather than his head. When he finished a 2-foot section, he stepped back. "Now it acts as one piece," he said. 20 stones with gaps between them, heat unevenly cool, unevenly stress each other at the joints. 20 stones packed with clay heat together, hold together, release together. The wall becomes a thermal unit rather than a collection. She understood the distinction. She had been building a collection. She needed to build a unit. They worked through the first week of November in the particular silence of two people whose communication had reduced to what was strictly necessary and found that sufficient. Neil would indicate a problem with a gesture, a tap on an unstable course, a pointed finger at a gap she had missed, a slight shake of his head at a stone she had chosen by color rather than ring. Sable would correct without comment. The wall grew. The east wall reached shoulder height by November 8th. The stove corner which Neil had insisted on building densest now wrapped 3 sides of the iron box in stone, 2 courses thick at its base, tapering to 1 course at the upper reaches where the stovepipe emerged toward the ceiling. When Sable pressed her palm there after a day of steady firing, the warmth was not merely present, it was substantial. The deep, even warmth of material that had been slowly saturated with heat, the way good bread dough is saturated with air all the way through rather than just at the surface. She began to believe it was possible. She began more carefully to believe it might be enough. The December 15th hearing arrived in her mind each morning like a second task she could not address directly, only approach obliquely through the work on the wall. McBride's words had not left her. Fair men follow the law. The law said adequate shelter. She did not know precisely what the law considered adequate. She knew what adequate felt like from the inside, the difference between the stove corner where the stone held warmth through the pre-dawn hours and the west wall's still bare boards where frost formed on cold mornings in a thin white crust that proved the heat was traveling straight through the wood into the Nebraska dark. She needed the west wall done before the hearing. She was not going to finish it in time. The mathematics of available daylight, available stone, available energy in her own body had been running alongside the mathematics of heat and cold, Since October, two parallel calculations that refused to converge on a comfortable answer. She was one person. The river was 3 miles away. The stone was heavy. Her shoulders had stopped protesting and settled into a permanent condition she no longer thought of as pain, only as the price of the morning's first hour. A stiffness that worked itself out before she reached the river and waited for her on the sleeping shelf each evening. She was returning from the river on the 10th of November, fourth load of the day, the sled runners cutting clean lines in the first thin snow that had fallen overnight, when she heard hooves behind her on the track. Not Pruitt's matched bays, a single horse moving at a deliberate pace. Thomas Vane pulled his wagon alongside her at the walking speed that required effort to maintain. He had been working in Chadron since she had last seen him. He looked at the sled, at the stone on it, at the direction she was heading. "I have scrap timber," he said, "from the Hargrove barn repair last week. Pieces too short for structural work, but long enough for bracing." He kept his eyes on the track ahead, rather than on her, the manner of a man who had worked out what he wanted to offer before he arrived. "Your west wall. If the stone is falling inward, you need diagonal supports anchored floor to ceiling. Without them, the mass will find its weakest point eventually." Sable pulled the sled without stopping. He matched her pace. "How do you know about the west wall?" "Ruth Calloway mentioned it at the mill Thursday." He let a moment pass. "Also, I've been thinking about what you said. Something that holds. I think about structural problems. It's an occupational condition." She told him she could not pay for the timber or the labor. "I'm not offering it as a transaction," he said. "I'm offering it because the solution is interesting to me, and the problem matters." He slowed the wagon to a halt, which forced her to either stop or leave him behind. She stopped. He looked at her directly for the first time since pulling alongside. "My wife died 2 years ago. Our boy with her. Since then, I have been looking for work that means something beyond the work itself." He picked up the reins again. "I'll bring the timber Saturday." He brought it Saturday. He brought himself with it, arriving at dawn with a wagon load of diagonal cuts, off angles, the structural offcuts of other people's projects that were, as he had described, useless for primary framing, but suited exactly to the purpose of holding a massive stone against a board wall that had not been built to bear lateral pressure. He worked without ceremony, fitting the braces with a precision that struck Sable as almost musical, measuring twice, cutting once, setting each piece at an angle calculated to redirect the stone's weight downward rather than outward. He did not talk while he worked. Sable did not require him to. She continued her own work alongside his, packing the clay mixture Neil had taught her, checking the ring of each stone before placing it, building the west wall up behind the diagonal framework Vane was installing. By evening, the west wall had bracing it had not had in the morning, and the bracing changed the geometry of what the stone could do. The mass now had something to press against that would press back. Vane loaded his remaining timber, measured the roof pitch with his eyes, in the way of a man who automatically assesses structures for their relationship to load. Said nothing about what the assessment concluded, climbed onto his wagon. He looked back at the claim, the shanty transformed on the outside by nothing at all, on the inside by weeks of work that was invisible from the track. "The old stone mills in Ohio," he said, half to her, half to the thought he was following. "The ones built in the 1700s, when they still knew how to work with thermal mass. They'd stay warm for days after the furnace went cold. The stone remembered everything it had been given." She said she knew. He said he figured she did. He drove back toward Chadron. She stood in the doorway watching him go, aware of something she could not quite name. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude required a deficit she was not sure she had incurred. More like recognition. The recognition of someone who built things correctly, encountering someone else who built things correctly, each understanding the other's work without requiring it to be explained. The December 15th hearing came on a morning that had been cold for 3 days. The kind of sustained cold that was not the worst Nebraska could produce, but was sufficient to demonstrate the principle at stake. Sable arrived at McBride's office with Delia beside her. June left with Ruth Calloway, who had offered without being asked. Pruitt was there with his attorney, a Chadron man named Wills, who arranged his papers on the table with the methodical care of someone who relied on the impression of thoroughness to substitute for the substance of it. Pruitt himself looked at Sable with the expression she had come to read as his default setting, when outcomes were uncertain, professionally neutral, privately calculating. Neil Voss was also there. He had not been summoned. He had arrived before either Pruitt or Sable and was sitting in the chair nearest the window when they entered, his enormous scarred hands folded in his lap, his expression that of a man waiting for a wagon he has ordered. McBride looked at him. Neil looked back. Something passed between them that Sable suspected was an old acquaintance's shorthand. Wills presented Pruitt's case in the organized fashion of a man who had been paid to make inadequate evidence sound conclusive. Board construction with visible gaps, single-pane window, substandard heating capacity, structural modifications of questionable integrity. He used the phrase well-intentioned but unsafe 3 times, which Sable recognized as the phrase of a lawyer who knows his client's position is not wrong, but is also not quite right and needs the ambiguity to run in one direction. McBride let him finish, then he looked at Neil Voss. Neil stood without being asked and described the north wall, the east wall, the stove corner. He described it the way he described everything in the language of construction, with the specificity of someone who had built things and understood that specificity was the only form of honesty available to a person talking about physical objects. He described thermal mass. He described charge rate and release rate. He described the clay packing the course offset the angular loading of the lower stones. He described what a wall that had absorbed 8 hours of steady firing felt like at 2 in the morning when the stove had been banked for 3 hours. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not look at Sable. He did not look at Pruitt. He looked at McBride, one craftsman addressing another craftsman's capacity to understand. McBride asked 2 questions about the clay mixture composition. Neil answered them precisely. McBride dismissed the petition. He did not dismiss it warmly. He did not dismiss it with a speech about determination or against the odds success. He dismissed it on the merits, which was the only dismissal that could not be appealed on procedural grounds. He looked at Pruitt with the expression of a man who has found the same argument insufficient twice and would prefer not to find it a third time. Then he looked at Sable. The west wall, he said. It was not quite a question. It will be done before January, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. See that it is. She won the hearing. She walked out into the December cold, having won a hearing that Pruitt would not mount again in the same form. Beside her, Neil walked in his unhurried way toward his horse, and she fell into step with him long enough to say, "You didn't have to come." He untied his horse from the post. "Pruitt is going to come at you differently now," he said. "He won't use the law again. He'll wait." He mounted with the ease of a man who had been doing it for 50 years. Waiting is what men like that do best. Be ready for it in a form you don't expect. He rode north. She went back to the claim and started on the west wall. What Pruitt did next arrived not as a frontal approach, but as a letter delivered by the Chadron postmaster on the 22nd of December. The letter informed Sable that Edgar Pruitt, acting as holder of the outstanding note on the cast iron stove, currently installed at the McReary homestead claim, was exercising his right to demand payment in full by January 3, 1888, or the stove would be subject to repossession. She sat with the letter for a long time. Without the stove, there was no way to charge the walls. Without charged walls, the stone was simply cold material Ruth's root cellar in July, the ice that would steal heat rather than release it. She had built a system that required a heat source at its center, the way a body requires a heart. Remove the heart and the rest of the elaborate, painstaking, costly construction became worse than nothing, because it would draw warmth out of the room faster than bare boards would. Pruitt had not waited long. He had identified the one element that could not be replaced, the one component she could not haul from a river or build from scrap timber, and he had moved to take it. She counted what she had. $14, still the original 14, preserved with the ferocity of someone who knew it was the last line before nothing. The stove note was $18. She was $4 short. She went to bed that night and lay awake while the stove ticked steadily in the dark, the walls holding their heat, the girls breathing evenly beside her, and she did the arithmetic in every configuration she could construct. The numbers did not cooperate. They rarely did. Ruth Calloway came the next morning, which was either coincidence or the result of small community information moving faster than Sable had anticipated. Ruth had heard about the letter. She set a mason jar on the plank table. Inside it, coins, paper money, a sum that Sable did not count in front of her. "That's the rest of the loan," Ruth said. $4 and change. Pay Kraus directly and get a receipt before Pruitt can intercept the transaction. She looked at the walls, the work she had watched build from nothing through 3 months of effort. Something moved in her face that was not warmth exactly. Ruth Calloway did not traffic in warmth, but was the particular expression of a person who has revised a judgment and is not comfortable with how long the revision took. "You were right about the stone," she said. "I was wrong about the stone." It was the most Ruth had ever conceded in Sable's hearing. It cost her something to say it. Sable did not make it cost more by responding at length. She paid Kraus that afternoon. The receipt was in her coat pocket by 3 o'clock. The stove stayed. Pruitt did not contact her again before January. December finished the work that October had begun on the walls. The west wall reached its full height by the 28th, the timber braces holding the mass solidly against the outer boards, the clay joints sealed against the gaps that cold would otherwise exploit. She added the stone bench along the stove-side wall, 3 courses of the densest flat stone she had 4 inches deep at the height of a sleeping surface. And she understood this was not furniture. It was thermal storage positioned where it would matter most, where sleeping bodies could absorb what the stone released rather than losing it to the air above. The east wall remained incomplete. She did not have enough stone to finish it, did not have enough days before the weather made river trips impossible, did not have the strength in her shoulders to close the gap between what she had built and what the wall required. There was a section 2 feet wide near the northeast corner, where the boards remained bare, where frost formed first on cold mornings and lingered latest after the stove had been burning for hours. She packed the worst of the gaps with rags and spare fabric pressed clay into the deepest cracks in the chinking, did what was available to her. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. She built it anyway because partial was not the same as nothing, and she had learned to distinguish between the two. Christmas came and went without ceremony. She gave the girls warmth and food, both rationed, both sufficient, neither generous. Delia read to June from the primer in the evenings when the lamp oil held out. June fell asleep early those nights, curled on the stone bench with the blanket Sable had arranged to hold the bench's warmth against her small body, and Sable sat in the dark after the lamp was out, listening to the stove tick and the wind find the northeast corner, and work at it with the patient persistence of something that had all the time in the world. She did not have all the time in the world. She had January. The morning of the 11th arrived mild enough that frost on the windows softened by mid-morning, mild enough that water dripped from the roof edge, mild enough that June asked to go outside, and Sable said yes because the sun was flat and bright and the wind was absent, and the world looked for one morning like it had agreed to a temporary truce. June was outside for perhaps an hour. She came back pink-cheeked, laughing at something she had found in the snow, a feather, a track, some small evidence of life persisting at the margins of winter. Sable looked at her daughter's flushed face and felt the particular loosening of the chest that comes when a child's happiness is simple and uncomplicated and asks for nothing. That night, June woke coughing. The cough was wet lower in the chest than a surface cold, the sound of fluid rather than irritation. Sable pressed her palm to June's forehead, warm, too warm. By morning, the fever was established. Not critical, not yet, the 101 warmth of a body fighting hard rather than losing, but real. June lay on the stone bench with blankets piled over her breathing audible from across the room, and Sable fired the stove with careful steadiness, feeding it the way Neil had taught her, building coals rather than flame, keeping the heat flowing into the stone at the rate the stone could accept. She checked the northeast corner. The bare section of the east wall was cold to the touch, frost forming in the seams between the boards, despite the morning's fire. She hung a blanket over the worst of it, which helped somewhat and solved nothing. She was watching the sky through the south window at 2 in the afternoon when the color changed. Not the gradual shift of late afternoon. An instantaneous change in the quality of the light, as though someone had placed a filter over the sun. The blue going gray, the gray going dark. The clouds arriving from the northwest, not in sequence, but all at once, a solid ceiling that pressed down on the prairie like a hand closing. The temperature, which had been hovering near freezing all morning, dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to cross the room. She opened the door a crack. The wind hit her in the face, the true northwestern wind that came straight off the Canadian plains without interruption, carrying snow that was not falling, but flying hard horizontal pellets that stung the exposed skin and accumulated on every horizontal surface at a rate she had not seen in 3 months of watching Nebraska weather. She closed the door, latched it, looked at June on the bench at Delia sitting very still in the way she sat, when she understood that stillness was what the situation required at the stove, whose coals she had been building for 4 hours at the walls, that held what she had given them, and were being asked now to hold it under conditions she had designed them for but never tested. Stay low, she told Delia. Keep the blankets over your sister. Don't let them fall. She began feeding the stove. She fed it with the discipline of someone who understood that the fire was not warming the air. The air was already lost, already cycling out through every gap and crack, an inadequate joint that 3 months of work had not entirely sealed. She was warming the stone. She was loading the thermal mass the way a battery is loaded, with the understanding that the source would eventually fail, and what remained in the battery would be all there was. The wind found the northeast corner within the first hour and established itself there, a continuous high pressure from outside that drove cold through the gaps with a consistency worse than gusting. The temperature in the corner dropped visibly, the frost forming not just in the seams but across the face of the bare boards, a thin white crust that expanded as she watched. She dragged the last of the stockpiled loose stone from the corner where she had been storing it and packed it against the base of the east wall, as much mass as she could get between the bare boards in the room. It was not a wall. It was a barrier, rough and improvised, but it interrupted the cold's direct path from board surface to room air with something that had at least been warmed by the room, even if not by the stove. By 6 in the evening, the daylight was gone, and the storm was no longer a storm in the ordinary sense of weather. It was a condition. It had ceased to have an origin or a trajectory. It simply existed omnidirectionally, as though the cold had become the world's default state, and the warmth inside the shanty was the anomaly requiring explanation. June's cough worsened in the dark hours. Not critically, the fever was holding where it had been, not climbing, but the cough was exhausting her, the wet rattle of it coming every few minutes, the small body spending energy on the effort of breathing that it needed for other things. Sable changed the cold cloth on her forehead, checked the blankets, put her own coat over the pile, when the temperature in the room dropped another degree. She was feeding the stove its fourth piece of wood in an hour when she smelled it. Smoke. Not the faint smoke smell of a fire burning well, which was always present at low levels, but the acrid rolling bite of combustion products moving in the wrong direction. She looked up. Gray wisps curled from the seams around the stovepipe collar, gathering at the ceiling, beginning a slow descent. The wind had found the flue. The chimney worked because the pressure inside the pipe was lower than the pressure outside. The hot air rising created a draft that pulled room air and combustion gases upward through the pipe. But the wind at this velocity, hitting the pipe cap at the right angle, could reverse that pressure differential, forcing cold air down the pipe faster than the fire could push smoke up, backing the combustion gases into the room. The stove door was sealed. The damper was set correctly. None of it mattered. Physics did not negotiate. Delia started coughing. June, already coughing, intensified. Sable soaked a cloth in the water bucket, pressed it over June's face, told Delia to put her face in the blanket. She moved to the stove and opened the fire door, hoping the increased draw from the fresh air would clear the reversal. Smoke poured out. She shut the door, adjusted the damper to its most open position. The smoke continued. She stood in the thickening room and ran through her options in the 4 seconds she allowed herself for that exercise. The flue cap had shifted. She could see it in her mind, the cap she had installed following instructions she had gotten from the Chadron hardware clerk, a simple design meant to keep snow and rain out while allowing gases to escape. At this wind velocity, if the cap's angle had shifted even slightly, it would be acting as an intake rather than an exhaust. She could reach the cap from outside. From the ground with the ladder she kept along the south wall. In the dark, in 70 miles per hour wind and horizontal snow, at a temperature she could no longer estimate, but knew was somewhere past the threshold where exposed skin begins to fail. She picked up her coat. Delia's voice stopped her at the door, thin and controlled, and trying not to be afraid, Mama. Stay with June. Keep your face in the blankets. She went out. The world disappeared the moment the door was behind her. Not darkness. The snow carried a dim, reflective quality that made the night brighter than it should have been, but dissolution. There was no ground and no sky, only horizontal white noise, and a cold that entered through every gap in her clothing immediately, without the gradual seep of ordinary winter nights, as though the temperature were a material that had been waiting for the door to open. She found the corner of the shanty by touch and followed it to the south wall. The ladder was there half buried in drift, and she freed it with hands that were already losing their fine motor capacity, pulling it to the north face by memory, because she could not see the pipe from below, could not see anything except the white rushing dark of the storm. She climbed without feeling the rungs. She felt the pipe with her wrists rather than her fingers, working upward to the cap by memory and geometry, finding the edge of it with her forearm. It had shifted 30 degrees from its installed position. The wind had caught the raised edge and used it as a scoop. She gripped it with both hands and wrenched it back, pressing it down against the pipe until she felt the flange seal re-engage, until the resistance of correct seating was unmistakable, even through hands that had stopped reporting sensation. She climbed down. She followed the wall back to the door by touch. She fell through it into the room. The smoke was already thinning. The draw had restored itself, the fire reasserting its pressure differential against the pipe, pulling the remaining gas upward. Sable lay on the floor for a moment, her face pressed against the packed earth that was cold, but not as cold as outside her lungs, burning with air that was clean by comparison to what she had been breathing. She got up. She fed the stove. At 3 in the morning, the stove went cold. She had been precise about the wood, more precise than she had been about anything in her life, stretching each piece as far as it would carry heat before adding the next, and the supply ran out at 3 in the morning, with the storm still full and the temperature still falling, and perhaps 3 hours remaining before a Nebraska January dawn. She looked at the walls. The north wall was warm. She could feel it from 2 feet away, the radiant presence of stored heat that the stone had been accumulating since 7 that morning, 20 hours of careful firing. The stove corner was warm. The east wall where she had managed to build it was warm. Even the improvised barrier of loose stone against the bare east section held some residual warmth from its proximity to the room. Not hot, not the warmth of comfort or security, the warmth of something that has decided to keep what it was given for as long as it can. She went to the bench. She lay down beside June and gathered Delia from across the room, with one arm pulling both daughters against her body, arranging the blankets over all 3 of them, with the systematic care of someone who understands that body heat is now a resource to be managed. The stone beneath them was warm against her hip through the fabric. Genuinely warm, the deep, steady warmth of 20 hours of absorbed heat releasing itself now into the bodies lying against it. Delia's voice came small in the darkness. "Mama, are we going to die?" Sable thought about several things she could say. She chose the truth because Delia was 9 years old, and had been 9 years old in a world that required honesty from her, and she deserved honesty back. "I don't know, but if we do, it will be together, and if we don't, it will be because we didn't quit." Delia pressed closer, closed her eyes. Sable lay awake and felt the stone give back what she had given it. The air grew colder around them. Her breath was visible in the faint light from the storm outside. The east wall's bare section radiated cold from across the room, a negative presence she could feel on the back of her neck, where the blankets did not reach. She pulled them higher. The wall was doing what she had built it to do. Whether it would do it long enough was a question that only the hours before dawn could answer, and the hours before dawn did not answer questions in advance. They only arrived one at a time, each bringing whatever they brought. She felt the stone beneath her at 2 in the morning warm, at 3 when the stove died warm, at 4 warm, though less so, the temperature of the stone and the temperature of the room converging slowly toward each other as the reserve depleted, at what she judged to be 5 in the morning, barely warm. The difference between the stone surface and the cold air above them had narrowed to something she could measure only by holding still and paying very close attention. But it was still there. The difference was still there. June breathed. Delia slept. The storm continued outside as though it had always existed and always would. Sable lay between her daughters and the cold and kept her hand on the stone and felt the warmth diminish by increments so small that each individual moment felt like nothing, only the accumulation of moments revealing the direction of travel. She did not sleep. She did not pray exactly, though what she did in the dark hours might have looked like prayer from outside the focused, wordless attention of someone who has done everything available to do and is now present to whatever results from it. The stone gave back what she had given it for as long as it could. That was what she had built. That was all she had built. In the morning she would find out if it was enough. The light came before the sound. Gray at first, the colorless gray of a world that has spent itself completely and not yet decided what comes next. It came through the frosted window in flat sheets, without warmth, without direction, simply present where darkness had been. Sable became aware of it the way a person becomes aware of something that has been true for some time, before they noticed, gradually then completely. She was alive. She knew this because the cold was still uncomfortable rather than absent, and the dead are not uncomfortable. She lay still for a moment, her hand on the stone bench beneath her, measuring what was there. The stone was cool now, genuinely cool. The long night's reserve finally depleted to something close to room temperature. But not below it. The stone had not gone cold in the way the east wall's bare boards had gone cold, that specific killing cold she could feel radiating from across the room like the negative of heat, the presence of absence. The stone had simply reached equilibrium with the air around it spent, given out, emptied of what 20 hours of careful firing had loaded into it. It had held until it had nothing left to hold. Delia was asleep against her left side, her breathing slow. June was asleep on Sable's right, the fever still present in the warmth of her small forehead, but no higher than it had been at midnight, the body still fighting, not losing. Sable sat up slowly. Every joint announced itself. She stood and crossed to the east wall's bare section, the northeast corner where the boards had radiated cold all night, and pressed her palm flat against the wood. Ice had formed on the interior surface, a thin crystalline crust that had grown inward from the seams. The boards were as cold as the outside world. She crossed to the north wall, the one Neil had helped her build first, the oldest section, the most carefully constructed. She pressed her palm there. Warm. Faintly, genuinely, measurably warm. Not the warmth of a charged wall in full operation, but the warmth of something that has given almost everything it had and kept the last fraction for itself, the way a fire keeps a coal when the wood is gone. She stood with her hand on the stone for a long time. Outside, the storm had stopped. She understood this now, registering the silence that had replaced the sustained roar of the night. She went to the door, braced herself, opened it. The world was white and motionless. Snow had drifted against the shanty's north wall to the height of her shoulder, compressed into the dense architectural quality of wind-driven accumulation rather than fallen snow. The sky was the blue of deep cold, cloudless, the sun already above the horizon, and reflecting off the snow surface with a brightness that made her eyes ache after the dark hours. She could see across the Nebraska panhandle, to a distance she had not been able to see in months, the visibility of a world scoured clean. She could see the track toward Chadron buried under 3 feet of drift. She could see in the far distance smoke rising from chimneys. Not all the chimneys she could identify by their locations. Not every homestead she knew to be out there. Some chimneys, not all. She closed the door. She set about rebuilding the fire with the wood she had been given by Ruth 2 weeks before, the reserve she had kept in reserve, and she fed it in the way that mattered now, not for warmth immediately because her body had managed through the night and could manage through an hour more, but to begin recharging what the night had spent. The stone needed to be loaded again before the next cold came, because the next cold would come. It always came again. June woke while the fire was finding its footing. She opened her eyes and looked at her mother with the uncomplicated directness of a child who has not yet learned to edit what her face shows. "Are we still here?" she asked, her voice rough from the night's coughing. "We're still here," Sable told her. June considered this for a moment with the gravity of someone processing information that has genuine weight. Then she said she was hungry, which was the most reassuring thing she could have said. Delia woke to the smell of the fire. She sat up, looked at the room, the stove active, the walls intact, the morning light coming through the frosted glass, and then looked at her mother with the expression of a 9-year-old who has been very frightened for a very long time and is not yet certain whether the fear is over. Sable met her eyes. Delia looked at the north wall. "The stones are still warm," Delia said. "I know. I felt them last night. When I woke up, I put my hand on them." She paused. "I went back to sleep because they were warm." Sable turned back to the stove so her daughters would not see her face. McBride arrived 2 hours after dawn, which meant he had ridden out before full light, picking his way along a track he could not see, following the line of fence posts she had noticed he always used as his guide when the snow was heavy. He tied his horse to the post she had straightened in October and stood in the yard looking at the shanty for a moment before he came to the door. He was carrying something inside his coat. He stepped into the room, looked at the walls, pressed his palm to the north section with the deliberateness of a man who needs tactile confirmation of what his eyes are telling him. Held it there for a count she could see him keeping. He looked at June on the bench, at the blankets, at the improvised barrier of loose stone against the berries section. He looked at Sable. He reached inside his coat and removed a folded document. He placed it on the plank table. Every outstanding legal action related to this claim, he said. The welfare petition, the competing interest record, Pruitt's note demand. He smoothed the paper flat. Dismissed, withdrawn, and voided respectively as of this morning. I have the authority to act on all three. I am acting. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the judge's careful neutrality, not the fair man following the law. Something older than either, the look of a man who has spent his working life making the best decisions the law allows him to make, and has occasionally, in exchange for that discipline, been given the privilege of making one that is simply right. I judged the wrong thing, Mrs. McCreary. I won't make that mistake again. He left before she could respond, which she thought was probably intentional. There were, she knew, other claims to check, other doors he needed to reach before the morning was older. She listened to his horse's hooves compress the snow in a diminishing rhythm until the sound was gone. She picked up the document, read it through twice, folded it back along its original creases, put it inside her coat against her ribs where she had once carried Owen's claim papers. The news from Chadron came in pieces through the following days, carried by the people who had reason to move through the drifts before the roads were cut. The Brennan claim 2 miles south, 3 men dead found on the morning of the 13th between their house and their barn, 200 yards apart in the snow. The women had survived in the root cellar with the children. The gantry place on the east section line, the husband with frostbite through both hands, the house intact but barely the woodshed empty by midnight. Old Pearson, who had 3 times the cordwood Sable had owned in September, was found alive in his house by his daughter, but had burned his chairs and half the bedroom floor by morning. The storm had not distinguished between the prepared and the unprepared in any way Sable could construct as a simple rule. It had found every inadequacy in every structure at every level of provision. What it had not been able to find in the space she had built was enough inadequacy to be fatal. That was the whole of the difference, the sum of everything she had learned, taught, failed at, rebuilt, and refused to abandon. She had reduced the inadequacy below the threshold the storm required. Ruth Calloway came on the 3rd day after the storm when the track was passable for a horse if not a wagon. She came on horseback, which she had not done in the months Sable had known her, suggesting the urgency she would not otherwise have expressed. She knocked, she had never knocked before, always arriving with the direct confidence of a neighbor who considers knocking a formality beyond the necessities. And when Sable opened the door, Ruth stood in the cold with frost on her collar and looked at her with an expression that had given up trying to be anything other than what it was. The gantry boy, Ruth said. He rode to my place at 4 in the morning of the 13th. Couldn't find his father in the dark. I kept him until dawn. She paused. I had stone along my stove side. I built it in November watching what you were doing. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure I believed in it yet. Another pause shorter. I believed in it at 4 in the morning. Sable stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the plank table with coffee and did not discuss what either of them felt about the other's judgment over the previous months. The work of revision was evident in Ruth's face without requiring articulation. June's fever had broken the previous morning. The child was sleeping with the deep restorative sleep of a body that has finished its battle and is now conducting repairs, and Sable told Ruth this because Ruth had earned the information. People are going to want to know, Ruth said, what you did, how you did it. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity. There will be another storm. There will always be another storm, Sable said. Ruth looked at her with something that had traveled a long distance from where it began, from the measured skepticism of that first visit in September, to whatever this was now, this expression that had dropped the weight of withheld endorsement and replaced it with something simpler. Then you'd better be ready to explain it more than once. The teaching began before she planned it. Eric Gantry came first, the father, both hands bandaged, moving carefully. He arrived with his eldest son, who was 14, and had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which was considerable. Eric looked at the walls for a long time without speaking, pressing his palms to the north wall, the stove corner, the east wall's built sections. He crouched at the base and examined the clay packing in the joints. He was not an unintelligent man. He had simply not known that this was possible, and now he did, and the knowing had arrived at considerable cost. "Show me the stone," he said, "how you choose it." She showed him. She walked him through the sorting by weight, the ring test, the difference between the sound of good stone and bad. She showed him the coarse offset, demonstrated the clay mixture, explained the angle of the lower layers in the way Neil had explained it to her. Not as rules to memorize, but as responses to what stone naturally wants to do, redirecting rather than fighting the material's inclinations. She showed him the stove corner and explained the principle of building density around the heat source, first radiating outward. Eric asked questions that were practical rather than theoretical. The questions of a man who wants to build something tomorrow rather than understand something in the abstract. She answered them in the same register. They were in the same language. She realized the language of people who need things to work rather than people who want things to make sense. His son took notes on the back of an envelope with a stub of pencil. The Hargrove family came the following week. Mrs. Hargrove's boy, the child whose illness had driven the request for emergency shelter at the schoolhouse, had recovered fully, his lungs clear. His energy restored to the particular ferocious vitality of an 8-year-old who has been sick and is now emphatically not. Mrs. Hargrove herself was a woman in her middle 40s who had moved with her husband from Indiana 4 years before and had survived 2 Nebraska winters through a combination of adequate preparation and favorable weather. The third winter had been neither favorable nor something adequate preparation alone could address. She came to learn. She stayed 3 hours. She left with a list of what she needed from the river and a clear picture of where to begin. Sable thought often during those first weeks of teaching about the difference between what Neil had given her and what she was giving these families. Neil had given her technique grounded in principle, not just how to do something, but why the something worked, so that when her circumstances diverged from his instructions, which they inevitably did, she had the principle to navigate by, rather than only the technique to fail against. She tried to give the same thing, not always successfully. Some people wanted the steps more than the reasoning, and she gave them the steps because steps followed imperfectly were better than principles understood without application. But she tried to give both because she had learned that the principle was what survived when the technique ran out. Thomas Vane came back in mid-February with timber he said was left over from a barn project, which was either true or generous, and in either case welcome. He spent 2 days reinforcing the west wall bracing, which had taken torque from the storm's pressure, and developed a slight outward lean that he identified before she had fully registered it. He worked with the same quality of focused silence she had noticed in October, the attention of someone for whom the work itself is a sufficient conversation. On the second evening after Delia had taken June to bed, Sable sat at the table going over the list of families who had requested instruction, organizing them by location, thinking through the order in which it made sense to travel to their claims when the roads permitted. Vane was cleaning his tools at the end of the plank, the systematic organization of a craftsman who treats his equipment as an extension of his own capability. "You said something the first time I saw you," he said, not looking up from the tools. "Pulling that sled. I've been thinking about it since." She waited. "Something that holds. That's what you said." He set down a plane, picked up a chisel, wiped the blade. "I've been building things for 20 years. Wagons mostly. Some structures. The question I always come back to is whether what I built will hold the weight it's asked to hold in conditions worse than the ones I designed for. Because conditions are always worse than you designed for eventually." He set the chisel down. "You answered that question a different way than I would have. You didn't make the walls stronger. You made them remember." She looked at him across the lamp. "It's what the material does," she said. "I just used it correctly. Nobody was using it correctly before you." He picked up another tool, considered it, set it with the others. "That's not nothing." He asked the following morning before he loaded his wagon whether he could build her an additional room. A proper framed room off the north side of the shanty with a foundation he would lay himself, walls designed from the beginning to accept stone lining rather than requiring it to be retrofitted against boards that were never meant for the purpose. She looked at him for a moment, reading the offer for what it was beneath its practical surface. Not charity, not courtship exactly, not anything that required an immediate accounting. an extension of the same impulse that had brought him with scrap timber in October. The desire to build something that would last for someone who had proved she understood what lasting meant. "Build it right," she said, "or don't build it at all." He nodded once. He drove toward Chadron. She watched him go and did not try to categorize what she felt because the feelings were not yet in a category, only in motion, developing at the rate that things develop when they are not forced. Neil Voss came to the claim on the second day of April when the snow was pulling back from the south-facing ground and the first brown grass was beginning to show itself in the low spots where meltwater had pooled and receded. He came in the morning, which was his usual time. He sat at the table, which he did not usually do, and he accepted the coffee she poured him, which was also unusual. His hands were on the table rather than reaching for work. She noticed this as she might notice a door open that was always closed, not alarming in itself, but an indicator that the situation had shifted from its established form. He looked at the north wall, at the stove corner, at the east wall, which now had a complete lining following 2 more weeks of river trips she had made through March while the ice was breaking. He looked at it with the expression of someone reviewing finished work that no longer requires attention, that has moved from the category of ongoing to the category of done. "Anna would have been 31 this year," he said. Not to her, not to the room, not to anything present. To the space where that fact existed, where it would always exist regardless of who was listening. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not reduce the statement to something smaller than itself. He finished the coffee. He stood with the careful deliberateness that she had noticed increasingly over the winter in his movements, the economy of a man managing a body that was presenting new negotiations daily. He looked at her directly, which was also unusual. Neil looked at work rather than at people as a general principle. "You don't need me anymore," he said. It was not a complaint. It was not even a statement of loss. It was an observation delivered with the same precision he applied to everything else, accurate, stripped of ornamentation offered, because accuracy was what the situation required. "I know what to do," she said. "You made sure of that." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and looked back at the walls one more time. The north wall, the stove corner, the east wall, completed the stone bench where Delia sometimes did her lessons, and June always slept. He did not say anything else. He went out. She heard his horse leave at the steady pace he maintained, for everything unhurried, consistent. The pace of a man who had been moving through difficult terrain for a very long time. She found him 3 days later when he did not arrive on the 4th morning, and she rode to his place on the horse Ruth had lent her for travel since the roads cleared. He was in bed on his back, his hands folded on his chest, with a neatness she suspected was not accidental. His face held the particular stillness of someone who had put things in order before lying down. The cold morning air in his house told her he had been gone since the night at least. She sat with him for a while. She did not know what the custom was for sitting with someone in this circumstance, so she simply sat in the chair beside the window in the April light that was coming through clean and direct now that the storms were done, and she let the silence be what it was. She buried him 3 days later in the small cemetery behind the Chadron Church on a hill that caught the wind from the northwest. Ruth came. The Gantrys came. Mrs. Hargrove came with her boy, who stood with the graveside seriousness of a child who understands that adults require gravity in certain moments, even when the child does not fully understand why. Thomas Vane came and helped lower the coffin with the care of a man who builds things that need to go into the ground correctly. McBride spoke a few words. He spoke them in the plain style of a man who did not confuse ceremony with meaning. He mentioned that Cornelius Voss had built 3 stone structures on the James River in the 1870s that were still standing, that he had come to the Nebraska Panhandle after a loss that he did not discuss with people, that he had spent the last winter of his life giving what he knew to someone who would use it. Sable stood at the grave after the others had begun walking back to their wagons. She had been thinking about what to say if she were the kind of person who said things at graves, and she had found only this, that the work continued, that the teaching continued, that the principle he had handed her would move through every family who had asked her how she survived, into every wall they would build, every fire they would bank, every cold night they would move through, because the stone remembered what the fire had given it. That was what he had left. Not the technique, the understanding that the technique was possible. She walked back to her horse in the April wind. Edgar Pruitt came in June. He came alone. No attorney, no matched bays, a single horse, a plain saddle, a man traveling without the apparatus of his professional identity. He knocked, which he had never done before. She opened the door. He stood with his hat in both hands in the manner of a man who has rehearsed this moment and found that rehearsal did not cover the full territory of it. He looked older than he had in December. Not aged exactly, the winter had changed something in his face that was less about time than about revision. My brother's family, he said. The Hargroves. His boy was the child in the schoolhouse. He turned the hat in his hands. I didn't know Meredith had come to you. She didn't tell me until February. He stopped. I've been in this business a long time, Mrs. McReary. I have seen a great many people come out here and fail in a great many ways. I built my business on that pattern. I thought I understood it thoroughly. He looked past her at the room at the walls. I understood the pattern. I did not understand you. She waited. The note on your stove, he said. I want to cancel it formally. I have papers. He reached inside his coat, produced a document, held it out. Also the eastern parcel that was Cole Drett's original claim. I've held it since I bought out his interest. I want to transfer it to you. He watched her face. Not as an apology. I'm not sure apology is the right category for what I owe you. As a business decision. The McReary claim with the eastern parcel attached is a viable operation. Without it, you're farming an edge. I'd rather have a viable neighbor than a failing one. She took the document, read it. The numbers were what he said they were. I've been telling people you survived because your neighbors brought you wood, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see the cost. After the storm, I told people it was charity that kept you alive, not the walls. He met her eyes for the first time since arriving. That was false. I knew it was false when I said it. I said it anyway because the truth was inconvenient to my position. He put his hat back on. I intend to correct that. I've already started. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $18 note, about the welfare petition, about standing at the river in October pulling stone while his offer sat at $60 and his attorney organized papers designed to remove her daughters from her care. She thought about the fact that his brother's child had lain on the stone bench at the Chadron schoolhouse and absorbed warmth from a wall she had built in a single night and had lived. Don't make me regret this, she said. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, more like a man who has handed over a weight he had been carrying at considerable inconvenience and is not yet certain whether he is lighter or simply less defended. I'll try not to give you reason, he said. He rode toward Chadron. She stood in the doorway watching him go, the June prairie grass moving around her claim. In the warm wind, the walls of her shanty solid at her back. Thomas Vane broke ground on the addition in July. He laid the foundation himself, working in the early mornings before the heat was full, cutting the footing trench with a precision that she watched from a distance, recognizing the same quality of attention she had seen in Neil Voss's hands. The attention of someone who understands that what goes into the ground matters more than what shows above it, because what goes into the ground cannot easily be corrected later. He designed the new room with stone lining built into its original framing, rather than retrofitted channels in the wall studs to accept flat stone, the stove connection planned from the beginning to radiate into both spaces, the bench position calculated before the first board was cut. He consulted her on every decision that involved the thermal logic, deferring with the naturalness of someone who recognizes the boundary of his own expertise without being ashamed of it. They worked alongside each other through those summer months with an ease that Sable recognized as the rarest kind of human comfort, the comfort of someone who requires nothing from you except what you actually are. He did not ask her about Owen. She did not ask about Kirsten. What they each carried from those losses was present in the way they worked, in the care they gave to things that needed to last, in the particular seriousness they brought to the question of what holds and what fails, and why the difference matters. It was, she thought, a kind of conversation that did not require language. In September, he asked if she would consider marrying him. He asked it the way he asked structural questions, plainly with the understanding that the answer had engineering implications he was prepared to work with either way. She told him she needed to think. She thought for 3 days, during which he continued building the addition without reference to the question, which she appreciated. She thought about what marriage had meant the first time, the warmth of it, the shared weight, the particular grief of losing someone who had been load-bearing in ways she had not fully understood until the load fell on her alone. She thought about what she had built in the 14 months since arriving in Nebraska with $14. She thought about Delia, who was 10 now, who had watched her mother haul stone and rebuild collapsed walls and walk into a blizzard to fix a chimney cap, and had filed all of it away in the part of her that was becoming who she would be. She thought about June, who had survived a fever and a blizzard and asked for breakfast the morning after both, which was the most practical response available to a 6-year-old. She thought about what Thomas Vane was building in her yard, stone by stone, joint by joint, with the foundation already in the ground and the framing going up straight. On the fourth day, she told him yes. They married in October of 1888 at the Chadron Church in a ceremony attended by Ruth Calloway, the Gantry family. Mrs. Hargrove with her recovered boy, Judge McBride, who shook Vane's hand with the expression of a man approving a sound structural decision, and 17 other families who had spent the summer learning from Sable what she had spent the previous winter learning from necessity. By December of 1888, the addition was complete. The new room held warmth from a shared thermal mass that ran between both spaces. Sable's design drawn out on the back of an envelope over 3 evenings, with Vane checking her calculations against his structural knowledge. On a cold night in December, not the cold of January, not the storm, just the ordinary deep cold of a Nebraska winter working at a well-built structure. Sable sat alone in the original room after the girls were asleep, after Vane had gone to bed, and pressed her palm to the north wall. It was warm under her hand. It had been firing since noon, 8 hours of steady coals, and it was warm in the deep way of a fully charged mass. Not the surface warmth of recent heat, but the radiating warmth of something saturated, giving back evenly through its full thickness at the rate the room could accept. For the first time in 2 years, she did not have to think about what she had to do next to survive the night. The walls knew their work. The fire was banked correctly. The stone would hold through until morning, and in the morning she would fire it again, and the cycle would continue with the reliable consistency of something built correctly for the conditions it was built to face. She sat in that warmth for a long time, not thinking about wood counts or hearing dates or offers she would not accept, not running arithmetic, not planning the next wall or the next teaching or the next defense against the next form of pressure. Just sitting with her hand on the stone, feeling the warmth she had given it, come back to her in the patient, unhurried way of something that has no reason to rush. The stone did not create heat. It never had. It only held what you gave it and returned it at the rate the world required. She had given it months of labor, weeks of failure, years of refusal to accept the arithmetic that said she could not do this. The stone had held all of it. On cold nights, it gave back what it could. That was enough. In Nebraska in January, in a 10 by 14 shanty with 2 daughters and $14, and the wrong kind of hands for this work. Enough was the whole of what survival asked for the precise threshold between the world that killed you and the world you lived in. By 1895, 37 families in the Nebraska Panhandle had lined their walls with stone from Lou River, using methods that could be traced back to the McReary claim on the Chadron section road. 14 of those families taught others. The teaching spread in widening circles through the territory, the way useful knowledge spreads without attribution, without ceremony adopted by each family, as though they had arrived at it themselves because they had arrived at it themselves, which was the nature of instruction that gave principle rather than only procedure. People called it McReary's method or Sable's wall, depending on which county they were in. By 1900, most people did not call it anything, because by 1900, it was simply the way you built if you built to last. Sable taught until the work of teaching, in the work of the claim, in the work of raising 2 daughters who grew into women, who could do most things their mother could do became more than one pair of hands could fully manage. Then she taught through Delia, who had her mother's eye for structure, then through June, who had her mother's patience with people who needed to understand the principle before they would trust the technique. The knowledge passed forward in the way that things pass forward when they are genuinely useful, not preserved behind glass, but worn smooth with use, changed in small ways by each new pair of hands, always recognizable at its core. Thomas Vane died in the spring of 1918, the year the influenza moved through the territory, in the bedroom of the house he had built with his own hands on the foundation he had laid in the summer after the blizzard. He died in a warm room, the stone walls holding the March heat with the reliability of 30 years of well-made joints, and Sable sat with him through the last night, the way she had sat with Neil Voss in the chair by the window, in the silence of someone who has learned that presence is what the moment asks for. She lived 4 more years after that into the spring of 1922 in the house on the McReary claim that had grown from its original 10 by 14 feet into a structure with 4 rooms, a kitchen, a proper parlor, stone walls throughout a foundation Thomas had reinforced twice in 30 years and pronounced the second time sufficient for the next 100. She was 69 years old. Her hair had gone fully gray. Her hands showed every year of the work they had done. Her eyes were still the eyes of someone who, when looking at a structure, was automatically calculating whether it would hold. Delia was there at the end, her daughter who had been 9 years old on the sleeping shelf in the blizzard and had pressed her palm to the warm stone in the dark and gone back to sleep because the warmth was enough. June was there who had asked for breakfast the morning after the worst night of their lives, with the practical directness of a child who had learned from her mother to address what was in front of her. The walls of the house on the McReary claim still stand. They have been modified over the decades since 1922. Some rooms added some materials, changed the cast iron stove, replaced twice, but the stone lining on the north wall, the stove corner, the east wall that was finished in the spring of 1888 after the blizzard proved its necessity, those sections remain. The stone is dark gray, flat, dense, chosen by weight and ring from the Lute River bank, by a woman who had never built anything before she needed to, who arrived at the principle of thermal mass through a cold floor in the dark, who was told she would die by everyone who knew the arithmetic, and survived by understanding what the arithmetic was missing. On a winter afternoon, if you put your hand flat against that wall, you will feel the cold of the stone first, the surface cold of material that has been absorbing the winter air from outside. But if you hold your hand there, if you hold it long enough, something changes. The warmth comes up from inside the stone, from the depth of it, where the room's heat has been slowly working through the mass since morning. It is not a dramatic warmth. It is not enough to heat a hand in any meaningful way. It is simply the warmth of something that was given heat and kept it and is giving it back at the rate the world requires, with the patience of material that does not distinguish between one season and the next. Some things hold. That is all they need to do.